They always look down first, at the floor, at the hands that clean it, never at the person holding the mop. The station lights hummed in a soft violet glow, reflecting off polished alloy corridors that stretched for nearly half a mile. Every surface designed to impress visiting nobles who measured worth in silence and shine. Ethan Cole moved through it all like he didn't belong. Gray uniform slightly worn at the edges, boots leaving faint damp prints that vanished seconds later as the self-drying floor activated beneath him, his movements precise, economical, almost mechanical, as if every step had been calculated down to the inch. Overhead, the filtration vents pulsed with a steady rhythm, pushing conditioned air at exactly 72 degrees Fahrenheit, a comfort standard reserved for high-ranking guests. Though Ethan never seemed to notice the difference, his focus fixed on the thin film of dust that most sensors would have missed entirely. Across the corridor, a group of nobles passed, their garments shimmering with embedded light threads, their voices low but edged with quiet superiority, and none of them slowed, none of them acknowledged him, because they weren't supposed to, because people like Ethan existed in the background, part of the system, not part of the conversation. Then came her presence before her voice, a shift in the air, subtle but unmistakable, like pressure dropping before a storm. Lady Valyra of the Thylacine houses, her blue skin catching the overhead light with a soft, iridescent sheen, her posture flawless, every movement deliberate, as if gravity itself adjusted to her expectations, and when she stepped forward, her heel landed directly across the section Ethan had just finished polishing, leaving a sharp, visible mark that disrupted the perfect reflection beneath her. She paused, not to apologize, but to observe, golden eyes lowering slightly as if studying a minor inconvenience. And for a brief moment, the entire corridor seemed to hold its breath. Ethan didn't react right away, didn't sigh, didn't look annoyed. He simply adjusted his grip on the mop and stepped forward, erasing the mark with a single smooth motion, restoring the surface to its previous flawless state as if nothing had happened at all. "You missed a spot," she said, her voice calm, measured, not cruel but not kind either, the kind of tone used when correcting something expected to obey. Ethan nodded once, not defensive, not submissive, just acknowledging the statement like it was data. "Thank you," he replied quietly, his voice steady, carrying just enough to be heard but not enough to demand attention. And then he moved on, continuing down the corridor with the same controlled rhythm. Valyra watched him for a second longer than necessary, something in his response not quite aligning with her expectations, because there had been no hesitation, no resentment, no attempt to please, just completion of a task, as if her presence changed nothing at all, and that, more than anything, felt wrong. Behind her, the station's central systems adjusted lighting levels by 2%, recalibrating to her biometric profile, but Ethan didn't look up, didn't even glance at the shift, as if he already knew it would happen, as if everything here moved exactly the way he expected it to. Somewhere deeper in the station, a system check initiated without being scheduled, a silent process running beneath layers of encrypted code, unnoticed by the nobles discussing trade routes and extraction rights, unnoticed by the staff rushing to meet impossible standards, but not unnoticed by the system itself, because for a fraction of a second, it paused, recognized something, and then continued as normal. Valyra turned away, dismissing the moment, yet the faintest crease formed between her brows, a question she didn't voice, because in her world, janitors didn't leave impressions, they erased them. And still, as she walked, she found herself glancing back once more, just in time to see Ethan stop beside a maintenance panel, kneel, and adjust something with quiet precision. And when he stood again, the corridor lights stabilized, the hum softened, and the entire wing felt smoother, like friction had been removed from reality itself. She didn't thank him, didn't ask what he did, but for the first time since stepping aboard the station, she noticed something she couldn't categorize, something that didn't fit into hierarchy or status or protocol, and it lingered just long enough to matter, even if she refused to admit it. "Respect is easy when nothing is at risk," Valyra said quietly, though she was not speaking to anyone in particular as the negotiation chamber adjusted its gravity balance by a fraction of a percent to accommodate her presence. The circular room stretching nearly 100 feet across with a ceiling that shimmered like liquid glass, displaying a live projection of the star system they intended to claim. Every orbit line glowing in precise mathematical harmony. Delegates from 6 houses stood, arranged along the perimeter, their voices controlled, their smiles practiced, each one measuring advantage in silence rather than words. And at the far edge of the chamber, nearly invisible against the polished wall, Ethan Cole moved with a cart of maintenance tools, his gray uniform blending into the background like an afterthought. Yet his eyes tracked everything, not with curiosity, but with quiet confirmation. As if each detail aligned with something already known, Veolyra stepped forward, her tone steady as she presented her claim, outlining extraction rights, transit corridors, and projected yields down to the last decimal, her confidence sharp, precise, the kind that came from years of never being questioned by those beneath her rank. Yet as she spoke, a flicker of hesitation crossed one of the display panels behind her, a brief distortion in the data stream that caused a ripple of murmurs across the room. It lasted less than a second, barely noticeable, but enough to shift attention, enough to plant doubt, and Veolyra's gaze tightened as she recalibrated her argument mid-sentence, compensating without pause, refusing to let the flaw define her. Across the chamber, Ethan paused beside a wall console, setting his cart aside with a soft metallic click, his fingers moving over the interface not like someone guessing, but like someone restoring something to its intended state. And the distortion vanished instantly, the projection stabilizing with a clarity that drew approving nods from the delegates. No one acknowledged him, no one asked what he had done, because in their world, corrections simply happened, systems functioned because they were meant to, not because someone ensured they did. Veolyra finished her statement, her voice unwavering. Yet her eyes shifted for a fraction of a second toward the far wall, catching the exact moment Ethan stepped back, returning to stillness as if he had never been there at all. Impressive recovery, one delegate remarked, though his tone suggested calculation rather than praise, and Veolyra inclined her head slightly, accepting the acknowledgement while knowing it was not entirely hers to claim. The chamber lights dimmed by 2% as the system adjusted for energy efficiency, a standard protocol, but the timing was precise, almost deliberate, and Ethan's reflection flickered across the polished surface, distorted for just an instant before disappearing again. The negotiations continued, voices rising and falling in. Controlled patterns, alliances forming and dissolving in subtle glances. But Veolyra found her attention dividing. A part of her mind tracking the conversation while another replayed the sequence of events. The flaw, the correction, the silence that followed, and the way the janitor had moved without hesitation, without seeking approval or recognition. When the session concluded, the delegates dispersed in clusters, their decisions postponed, their certainty slightly unsettled, and Veolyra remained behind for a moment longer, standing at the center of the chamber as the star system projection slowly rotated above her, its light casting soft reflections across her skin. She turned, expecting the space to be empty, but Ethan was there, already moving along the perimeter, collecting tools, restoring order to a room that prided itself on perfection. "You adjusted the system," she said, not as a question, but as a statement that tested its own truth. Ethan did not stop, did not look up immediately. He simply secured a panel with a quiet click before answering. It needed adjustment, his voice calm, neutral, offering nothing beyond the obvious. Veolyra studied him, searching for something beneath the surface, some indication of intent or ambition, but found only stillness, a kind of presence that did not push or pull, that simply existed with certainty. "You act as if this place depends on you," she said, her tone sharpening slightly, probing for a reaction. Ethan finally met her gaze, just for a moment, his expression unchanged. "Everything depends on someone," he replied, then lowered his eyes again, returning to his work as if the conversation had reached its natural end, leaving Veolyra standing there, the weight of his words settling in a place she could not quite define, because for the first time since arriving, the station did not feel like something she controlled, but something she was still trying to understand. Control is not the same as understanding, Ethan said once, though not to her, not directly. The words spoken low as he adjusted a maintenance conduit no one else had noticed was misaligned by less than a quarter inch. Yet the entire corridor responded, lighting stabilizing, airflow smoothing into something almost imperceptibly more balanced. Veolyra heard it anyway, not the words, but the effect. The way the environment seemed to settle as if a quiet tension had been released, and it irritated her more than she expected, because nothing in this station was supposed to function outside the authority of those who commanded it. She found him again near the observation deck, a wide arc of transparent alloy stretching nearly 200 feet, offering a direct view of the star system in question, its central star casting a steady golden light across orbiting bodies that moved with precise, predictable elegance, the kind of order that could be measured, owned, divided. Nobles gathered in small clusters, discussing projections, negotiating influence, their voices low but urgent, each one trying to secure a future that had not yet been decided. Ethan stood apart from them, near the edge, his cart positioned neatly against the wall, his attention not on the delegates, but on the stars themselves, as if he was not observing them, but verifying something already known. Veolyra approached without announcing herself, her steps silent against the polished floor, stopping just close enough to test whether he would acknowledge her without being prompted. He did not turn immediately, but after a moment, he shifted slightly, enough to indicate awareness without submission. "You spend a great deal of time where decisions are made," she said, her tone measured, probing. "For someone who claims to only maintain what matters." Ethan glanced at the star outside, its light reflecting faintly in his eyes. "Everything that matters ends up here," he replied, his voice calm, as if the statement required no defense. Veolyra followed his gaze, studying the system, the resource maps, the transit lanes, the layers of value assigned to each orbit and trajectory, and for a brief moment, she considered the possibility that she was not seeing the same thing he was. "You speak as if you understand the outcome," she said, a hint of challenge beneath her composure. Ethan's expression did not change, but there was a pause. Small, deliberate outcomes are usually decided before they are announced, he said quietly, then returned his attention to a panel beside him, adjusting a setting that caused the observation glass to recalibrate its tint by a fraction, reducing glare, improving clarity, a small change that none of the nobles acknowledged, though several unconsciously shifted their stance as the view became easier to focus on. Veolyra watched the adjustment, then him, then the stars again, and something in her certainly shifted, not enough to break, but enough to notice the possibility of imbalance. Behind them, a group of delegates raised their voices slightly, a disagreement forming over access rights, their authority asserted through titles and lineage, yet none of it seemed to affect Ethan, who continued his work with the same steady rhythm, as if the arguments were background noise to a process that did not depend on them. "Do you ever consider what happens when those decisions fail?" she asked, turning back to him. Her question sharper now, less about curiosity and more about testing limits. Ethan secured the panel with a soft click, straightened, and for the first time, faced her fully, his gaze direct but not confrontational. "They do not fail," he said, then after a brief pause, added, "They get corrected." The simplicity of the answer unsettled her more than any complex argument could have, because it implied a layer of control she had not accounted for, a system beyond the one she believed she understood. Somewhere deep within the station, a silent protocol initiated, unseen, unfelt, but precise. And for a fraction of a second, every system aligned in perfect synchronization, as if responding to an invisible confirmation. Veolyra did not know why, but she felt it, a subtle shift, like the difference between balance and perfection. And when she looked back at Ethan, he had already turned away, returning to his cart, moving on as if nothing had happened, leaving her standing there with a question she could not yet answer, and a certainty she could no longer fully trust. Power reveals itself in what people ignore. The system log displayed for less than half a second before auto-clearing, a diagnostic line buried so deep in the station's architecture that no noble would ever see it. Yet Ethan had already read it before it vanished, his reflection faint against the polished wall as he guided his cart through a service corridor that ran parallel to the main negotiation wing. A path designed for those who kept the system invisible. Veolyra was not supposed to be there, not in a corridor barely 4 feet wide with exposed conduits humming at a steady frequency, not in a place where temperature dropped to 68 degrees Fahrenheit to preserve system efficiency. Yet she followed anyway, her steps slower now, measured, as if each decision carried weight she had not accounted for before. She watched him stop beside a panel that most would never notice, its surface unmarked, blending perfectly into the wall, yet he reached for it without hesitation, fingers pressing a sequence that did not appear on any standard interface. And the panel responded, not with light, but with a subtle shift in the air, like a lock releasing that had never been visible. "You knew this was here," she said, her voice quieter than before, not demanding, but observing. Ethan did not turn his attention fixed on the system as he adjusted a calibration by less than 1%. "Everything leaves a pattern," he replied, his tone even, as if the statement explained itself. Veolyra stepped closer, the confined space amplifying every sound, every movement, and for the first time, she noticed the absence of hesitation in him, not confidence, not arrogance, but certainty, the kind that did not need to prove itself. "You are not assigned to this level," she said, her words sharper now, testing boundaries that felt less stable with each passing moment. Ethan secured the panel with a soft click, then straightened, finally facing her fully, the narrow corridor forcing proximity that neither of them acknowledged. "Assignments are for people who need direction," he said, his gaze steady, not challenging, not yielding. The answer lingered, heavier than its simplicity suggested, and Veolyra felt something shift again, not in the station, but in her understanding of it, because nothing about this interaction fit the hierarchy she had relied on. Behind them, a faint vibration traveled through the structure, a resonance that indicated a system-wide update, subtle enough that most would ignore it. Yet Veolyra felt it, a ripple of change that aligned too perfectly with the moment Ethan stepped away from the panel. "What did you just do?" she asked, the question escaping before she could refine it into something more controlled. Ethan moved past her, guiding his cart with the same quiet precision. "Maintenance," he said, as if the word carried the full weight of the action. Veolyra turned, following him back toward the main corridor, her mind replaying the sequence, the hidden panel, the immediate system response, the way the environment seemed to settle into a state that felt corrected. When they emerged into the wider hall, the lighting adjusted seamlessly, the hum of the system smoother, the air circulation perfectly balanced, and the nobles who passed by did not notice, did not question, because perfection was expected, not examined. Veolyra stopped, watching Ethan continue forward, blending once again into the background he seemed to control without ever claiming. And for the first time since she had stepped onto the station, she considered a possibility that unsettled her more than any political risk. That control here did not belong to those who spoke the loudest, but to someone who never needed to speak at all. And as she stood there, the system registered another silent confirmation, a sequence aligning beyond her access, beyond her authority, and she realized, with a clarity that felt both sharp and incomplete, that she was not observing a servant, maintaining a system. She was watching someone who understood it at a level she had never been meant to see. "You can measure authority by how quickly a system bends," Veolyra said under her breath as she stood before the central command interface, a curved console nearly 30 feet long that responded only to the highest clearance levels, its surface alive with layered data streams that tracked every function of the station in real time. The room was colder here, exactly 65 degrees Fahrenheit, optimized for processing stability, and the silence carried a weight that even the nobles respected. Because this was where control was supposed to reside, she extended her hand, her credentials verified instantly, granting her access to a subset of the system, enough to observe, to influence, but not enough to command fully, and that limitation, once acceptable, now felt like a boundary she had not noticed before. Behind her, the doors opened with a soft hydraulic whisper, and Ethan entered without hesitation, his cart stopping just inside the threshold, his presence as unassuming as ever, yet entirely out of place in a room that should have rejected him automatically. Veolyra did not turn immediately, her eyes scanning the interface as she initiated a minor adjustment to the environmental controls in the negotiation wing. A simple test, reducing lighting output by 5%, a change that should have taken effect within seconds. Yet the system paused, not failing, not denying, but waiting, as if confirming something beyond her authorization. She felt it then, that subtle delay, that fraction of a second where control was not absolute, and when the adjustment finally executed, it did so with a smoothness that felt permitted. "You are not assigned here," she said, her voice calm but edged with something sharper, a need to re-establish certainty. Ethan moved along the perimeter, his eyes briefly scanning a secondary panel before adjusting a calibration that did not appear on her interface. "Neither is most of what happens here," he replied quietly, his tone unchanged, as if the statement was simply an observation. Veolyra turned then, studying him fully, the distance between them measured not in feet but in understanding. "I issued a command," she said, stepping closer to the console, and the system hesitated. Ethan's gaze shifted to the interface, then back to her, not dismissive, not impressed, just aware. "It did not hesitate," he said. "It verified." The distinction settled into the room like a weight, subtle but undeniable, and Veolyra felt the shift again. That same imbalance she had noticed before, growing more defined, more difficult to ignore. "Verified what?" she asked, her voice quieter now, not because she lacked authority, but because she was beginning to question its limits. Ethan's eyes moved briefly across the data streams, reading them in a way that did not align with standard training. Then he stepped closer, stopping just short of the console, respecting a boundary he did not need to cross. "That the change would not disrupt anything that matters," he said. Veolyra followed his gaze, watching the system adjust, the lighting stabilizing, the energy distribution recalibrating, every variable aligning with a precision that exceeded her input. And for the first time, she realized that her command had not shaped the outcome. It had merely initiated a process that had already been defined. "You speak as if the system has its own authority," she said, testing the idea even as she resisted it. Ethan shook his head slightly, not in disagreement, but in correction. "No," he said. "It has a standard." The word lingered, simple, unadorned, yet carrying a meaning that extended beyond the interface, beyond the room, and Veolyra felt the realization forming, incomplete but unavoidable, that control here was not about issuing commands, but about aligning with something deeper, something she had not been granted access to. The console flickered for a fraction of a second, a hidden layer of data appearing and disappearing too quickly for her to read. Yet Ethan's expression did not change, as if he had seen it clearly, as if it had been meant for him. Veolyra stepped back slightly, not retreating, but recalibrating, her mind adjusting to a new possibility, that the system she believed she controlled was not responding to her authority, but to something else entirely, something that moved through it quietly, precisely, without ever needing to announce itself. And as she looked at Ethan, standing there in a gray uniform that should have made him invisible, she understood, with a clarity that felt both unsettling and inevitable, that she was not standing beside a man who worked within the system. She was standing beside someone the system recognized in a way she did not. The difference between control and permission is something most people never notice, Ethan said, though the words came after the realization had already begun forming in her mind, not before, as if he was confirming something she was only just starting to understand. The command chamber remained quiet, the interface glowing with layered data that flowed in perfect synchronization. Yet Veolyra no longer saw it as a system responding to her. She saw it as something evaluating her, something that allowed interaction but did not yield authority without reason. She stepped away from the console, her posture still composed, but her focus sharpened, no longer fixed on outcomes, but on patterns, on the subtle alignment that occurred whenever Ethan moved, whenever he adjusted something no one else noticed. "Then explain it," she said, turning fully toward him now, no longer observing from a distance, but engaging directly. "Explain why the system recognizes you in ways it does not." "Recognize me?" Ethan did not answer immediately, his eyes shifting briefly to the interface as another silent process completed, a sequence of confirmations cascading through layers of access that remained invisible to her. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried the same calm certainty that had unsettled her from the beginning. "Because I do not ask it to do what I want," he said. "I make sure it can do what it needs." The distinction settled deeper this time, not as a concept, but as a structure she could begin to trace. And Veilira felt something shift again, not in the station, but in her own understanding of it. The realization that authority here was not about imposing will, but about aligning with a framework she had never been shown. "You are describing ownership without claiming it," she said, her tone quieter now, more precise, as if testing each word before releasing it. "That is not how systems work." Ethan moved to the side panel again, his fingers brushing across a surface that did not respond to her touch, initiating a calibration that caused the entire command interface to stabilize at a level of efficiency she had never seen before, the data streams smoothing into a clarity that felt almost unnatural. "That is exactly how they work," he replied. "When they are built correctly." Veilira watched the change, not just the visible adjustments, but the absence of resistance, the way the system accepted his input without delay, without verification prompts, as if it already trusted the outcome. "Then who built it?" she asked, the question leaving her before she could frame it within the boundaries of protocol. Because the answer, whatever it was, mattered more than maintaining appearances. Ethan paused, just for a moment, his gaze shifting toward the observation window beyond the chamber, where the star system rotated in perfect alignment, every orbit precise, every variable accounted for. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that did not come from volume, but from certainty. Someone who understood that control is temporary, but structure lasts. The words lingered, filling the space between them with something unspoken, something that extended beyond the station, beyond the negotiation, into the system itself. And Veilira felt the final piece begin to settle, not fully formed, but undeniable, that the authority she had relied on was not the foundation here. It was a layer, a surface that could be granted or removed without changing what truly governed the system. Behind her, the interface flickered again, a deeper layer of access appearing for less than a second, a series of identifiers that did not match any noble house, any registered authority. And though she could not read it fully, she recognized one thing with absolute clarity. The system was not responding to Ethan. It was acknowledging him. She turned back to him slowly, the distance between them no longer defined by status, but by understanding, and for the first time, her voice carried something she had never allowed before, not uncertainty, but respect shaped by realization. "You are not maintaining this station," she said, the words steady, deliberate. "You are ensuring it remains exactly what it was designed to be." Ethan met her gaze, just for a moment, then looked away, returning to his card as if the statement required no confirmation, leaving her standing in a room she had believed she controlled, now seeing it for what it truly was, a system that did not belong to those who claimed it, but to someone who never needed to. A system only reveals its truth when something tries to break it. Ethan said quietly as the station lights shifted without warning, not dimming, not failing, but recalibrating across every corridor at once, a synchronized adjustment that rippled through the structure like a silent signal. Veilira felt it immediately, not as discomfort, but as absence, the absence of predictability, of control she had assumed was constant. And when she turned back to the central interface, the data streams were no longer flowing in smooth harmony. They were locked, frozen in place, each layer awaiting authorization that did not come. The chamber door sealed with a soft but final sound, not aggressive, not alarming, just decisive. And for the first time since her arrival, Veilira saw hesitation in the system itself, not confusion, but restriction. Outside the chamber, distant voices rose, nobles calling for clarification, for access, their authority suddenly ineffective against a system that no longer responded to titles or lineage. Veilira stepped forward, placing her hand against the console, her credentials scanning instantly. Yet the response that followed was different, not denial, not acceptance, but a simple message that hovered in the air before her, clean and unmistakable. Authorization pending. Her eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in focus, because this was not a failure. It was a condition, a state the system had entered by design, What did you do? She asked, her voice steady but carrying a weight that had not been there before. Ethan stood near the edge of the room, his cart untouched, his posture unchanged, as if this moment had always been part of the sequence. Nothing, he said, his tone calm. This is what happens when everything is evaluated at once. Veilira turned fully toward him now, the realization forming faster, sharper. Evaluated by what? She demanded, not raising her voice, but tightening every word with intent. Ethan's gaze moved briefly to the interface, then back to her, and for the first time, there was no deflection, no redirection, just clarity. By the system itself, he said. The words settled into the silence as the station held its breath. Every function paused, every process waiting, and Veilira understood then that this was not chaos. It was a test, a recalibration of authority that stripped away assumptions and left only what could be verified. Beyond the chamber, the star system projection dimmed slightly, its rotation slowing by a fraction, as if even the representation of control was being questioned. Veilira stepped back from the console, her mind moving through the implications, the hidden layers, the confirmation she had glimpsed but not fully understood. And when she looked at Ethan again, she no longer saw a man maintaining a system. She saw the one variable the system had not paused for. You knew this would happen, she said, not accusing, but confirming. Her voice quieter now, more precise. Ethan did not answer immediately, his silence carrying more weight than any explanation. And then, with a small shift of his stance, he stepped forward, closing the distance between them by a single measured step. It always happens, he said, when it matters. The interface flickered again, deeper this time, layers of access attempting to resolve, to identify, to confirm, and Veilira watched as the system moved past her credentials, past every noble authorization, searching for something else, something it recognized beyond status. The chamber remained sealed, the station held in perfect suspension, and in that stillness, Veilira realized the truth she had been circling since the beginning. That control here was never granted by rank, it was revealed by alignment. And as she stood there, waiting for the system to decide, she understood that whatever happened next would not be determined by who claimed authority, but by who the system accepted as its source. Authority is not declared, the system voice said at last, not loud, not commanding, but absolute, resonating through the chamber with a clarity that silenced every distant voice beyond the sealed doors. It is verified. And for a fraction of a second, the entire station seemed to narrow its focus, every sensor, every process aligning toward a single point. Veilira felt it like pressure, not physical, but conceptual, as if the structure around her was no longer a place, but a question waiting to be answered. The interface before her shifted, layers peeling back without her command, revealing deeper architecture she had never been permitted to see, streams of code and authorization chains cascading in patterns too complex for standard governance, each one tracing back to a root she could not identify, until the system paused again, not in uncertainty, but in recognition. Ethan stepped forward then, not hurried, not hesitant, his movement cutting cleanly through the suspended moment. And as he approached the console, the air itself seemed to adjust, temperature stabilizing to exactly 70 degrees Fahrenheit, lighting recalibrating to eliminate every shadow, the environment aligning with him rather than around him. Veilira did not speak, did not interrupt, because the answer she had been seeking was no longer something to ask, it was something to witness. Ethan placed his hand near the interface. Not on it, not activating anything in the way she had been trained to, and the system responded instantly, not with prompts or requests, but with acceptance, a seamless transition from suspension to flow, as if the pause had only been waiting for him. Owner confirmation in progress. The voice continued, softer now, almost unnecessary, and the data streams surged, not chaotically, but with purpose, aligning every subsystem, every authorization layer, every hidden protocol into a single, undeniable conclusion. Veilira's breath slowed, her mind tracking the sequence, the verification, the absence of resistance. And in that clarity, the truth settled fully into place, not as a possibility, but as a fact that reshaped everything she had believed about power, about control, about the system she had intended to claim. Ethan did not look at her, did not acknowledge the shift. He simply stood there, steady, as the station completed its evaluation, and when the voice spoke again, it carried no doubt, no ambiguity, only finality. Ownership confirmed. The chamber doors unlocked with a quiet release, the distant voices beyond them returning in a wave of confusion and relief, systems reactivating, processes resuming. But none of it felt the same, not to Valera, not anymore. She stepped back, not out of fear, not out of submission, but because the space between them had changed, defined now by understanding rather than assumption. "You hid this," she said, her voice controlled, but no longer edged with challenge, only realization. Ethan glanced at her briefly, his expression unchanged. "There was nothing to hide," he replied. "No one was looking." The simplicity of it settled deeper than any display of power could have, because it revealed the truth she had missed, that the system had never been controlled by those who claimed it, only maintained by the one who understood it. Beyond the chamber, the star system projection brightened again, its motion restored, every orbit precise, every path stable, and Valera followed its movement with new eyes, seeing not territory to possess, but a structure already held, already defined. She looked back at Ethan, at the gray uniform, the quiet presence, the absence of anything that demanded recognition, and for the first time, she understood the full measure of what she had been standing beside since the moment she arrived, not a servant within the system, but the one the system belonged to. And as the station resumed its perfect rhythm, she realized that power here had never needed to announce itself, because it had always been present, waiting for someone capable of seeing it. "The system did not change," Ethan said quietly as the chamber returned to its normal rhythm, the lights stabilizing, the hum of machinery settling back into its precise, controlled cadence. "You just saw it clearly for the first time." And Valera stood there, not responding immediately, her gaze fixed on the interface that now obeyed her commands again, yet no longer felt like something she controlled. Beyond the chamber, the nobles resumed their movements, their voices returning, their confidence rebuilding as if the interruption had been a temporary inconvenience rather than a revelation. But Valera could hear the difference, subtle but present, the hesitation beneath their certainty, the awareness that something greater had just been confirmed without their consent. She turned slowly, her posture unchanged, still regal, still composed. Yet her perception had shifted, and when her eyes found Ethan again, standing beside his cart as if nothing had happened, the contrast was no longer invisible. "You allowed it," she said, her voice steady, not accusing, not grateful, but precise. "You allowed the system to continue as if nothing had changed." Ethan adjusted the handle of his cart, the motion simple, grounded. "Nothing did change," he replied, his tone calm. "The system is still doing what it was built to do." Valera stepped closer, not to challenge, but to understand. The distance between them no longer defined by hierarchy, but by the difference between knowing and assuming. "And what is that?" she asked, her voice quieter now, shaped by the weight of what she had learned. Ethan looked past her, toward the observation window where the star system rotated in perfect balance, every orbit stable, every path aligned with a structure that existed long before any noble claim to remain stable, he said, no matter who stands inside it. The answer settled into her, not as a lesson, but as a boundary, a line she had crossed without realizing, and now could not step back from. The chamber doors opened fully, the delegates beginning to gather again, their discussions resuming with renewed urgency, unaware that the foundation beneath their negotiations had just been clarified in a way they would never fully grasp. Valera did not move toward them immediately, her attention still anchored to the man who had never once tried to assert authority, yet held all of it. "You could have taken control openly," she said, her words deliberate, testing the final piece of the truth she now understood. "You could have made them see it." Ethan met her gaze briefly, his expression unchanged. "They would not understand it," he said, then added, "and it would not change anything that matters." The simplicity of it carried more weight than any declaration, because it revealed the final distinction, That power here was not about recognition. It was about responsibility, about maintaining a structure that did not depend on acknowledgement. Veolyra nodded once, not in agreement, but in acceptance, the kind that came from seeing something clearly enough that denial was no longer possible. And as she turned toward the chamber, toward the nobles, toward the negotiations that would now proceed within a system she no longer misunderstood, she paused for just a fraction of a second. Behind her, Ethan had already resumed his work, guiding his cart along the corridor, his presence fading back into the background where no one thought to look, where no one thought to question. The floor beneath his path reflected the station lights perfectly, unmarked, uninterrupted, and for the first time, Veolyra saw it for what it truly was, not a surface to walk on, but a standard being maintained. Quietly, precisely, without need for recognition, she stepped forward. Then, her posture unchanged, her voice ready to speak among those who still believed control was theirs, but her perspective anchored somewhere deeper, somewhere beyond titles and claims. And as the star system continued its silent rotation beyond the glass, she understood that nothing she did here would ever truly own it, only align with it. Behind her, the faint sound of a mop gliding across the floor echoed softly through the corridor, steady, consistent, almost unnoticed, and yet it carried a meaning that reached far beyond the surface it touched, because in a system ruled by power, the one